evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Philip Kennedy. I've just seen I've got my label here. I've been attending a conference today. I mention it simply because this lecture this evening is part of a conference that's been convened by my colleagues Walter Scheidel and Andrew Monson here. Over the last 2 days, a conference on systems of trade and belief, exchanges of trade and belief in the ancient world. And this public lecture is part of that conference, and I'm very grateful to Andrew and to Walter for having convened the larger event and for organizing this evening's lecture with David Ludden. I'm very pleased to introduce. David, of course, is one of the most prominent historians of economic history, of the economic history of South Asia. He's currently the professor of political economy and globalization in the history department at NYU. He first worked in South Asia as a public health intern when he was in college at Yale, I believe, in 1968. But in graduate school in the 1970s, he migrated into studies and translations of Tamil literature and into research in economic and social history and development studies. He received his PhD in history in 1978 from the University of Pennsylvania, where he then went on to serve on the faculty from 1981 until 2007. There he chaired the South Asia program. He's also chaired the South Asia program for the Social Science Research Council. His research concerns histories of development and globalization in very long-term perspective. Until 1993, he focused on southern India, and then he moved his work into Bangladesh and nearby regions of northeast India. His published works include 4 edited volumes, 3 monographs, and over 50 academic articles and chapters. I'd like to mention just a few of those monographs. India and South Asia, A Short History was published in 2004 by One World Oxford. He's edited one of the 4 volumes of the Cambridge History of India, the particular volume being entitled An Agrarian History of South Asia. He's also published Peasant History in South India. But the one that I really can't help but mention, the one that's really the closest to my heart, I think it's his first publication, is the Kurun Tokai, an anthology of classical Tamil love poetry in translation. Something I just discovered today, that you are a fellow translator. That's great. His current writing project, in any event, is a book on the reproduction and transformation of imperial forms of knowledge, power, authority, and inequality under contemporary globalization. And I think it's aspects of that work that he's going to talk to us about today. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome David Ludden to the stage.
Okay. Thank you, Phil, and thank Walter and Andrew for organizing this. And thank you all for coming, too. I mean, especially for my colleagues who've been conferencing for the last 2 days. This is a little bit above and beyond the call of duty, so I really appreciate it. So the conference or the workshop that we've been at is about the integration of early societies, and this is a paper that's in that context. I've had really a lot of fun working on, because it's allowed me to return to some of my earliest work, including actually some meditations on Sangam poetry, which we heard a little bit about today, and work on South India that we talked about today, actually. And so it's quite nice to be able to return to this work with a rather different perspective than I had in the past, because now I'm really thinking more about this early society histories in terms of its relevance for contemporary thinking about the world we live in today. So let me begin with a question. It's something that's been puzzling me for the last couple of days, which is that what's really at stake? What's the real punchline for the importance of the study of the integration of early societies? I think Sheikh Zayed actually answered this question rather nicely when he said, as I read on the Abu Dhabi airport wall on arrival here, that a nation without a past has no present and future. this to me raises very important questions about where that past is, and what are its sources, what's its geography and its temporality, and who gets to write such a history of the past that makes the present and future of the nation? Who does it include and who does it exclude, and how does this history actually work in the everyday life of a nation? It's a very interesting set of problems, and I think that if you begin to approach the problem of what is at stake in the study of early societies, it actually ends up being rather logical to think of it as the exploration, the search for methods for understanding a world where the spatial and temporal scales of the world we live in actually are changing much more dramatically and more unpredictably than we really tend to normally think about. We tend to think that the spatiality of the world actually is confined by national boundaries, but I think that the beautiful thing about contemporary globalization is actually that we're beginning to realize that this is just not true, that national spaces are created by chopping up and packaging very old historical territories and spatial domains, and also combining and bringing together all sorts of disparate regions that have been formed over many centuries and created by interactions among lots of people and places that are way outside the national imagination, actually, and spaces in which territorial formations of time and of territory have variously incorporated and subordinated and marginalized and expelled countless peoples and their histories from the national past. So it's this kind of sensibility that I'm working with this evening, and that I've been really thinking about the last couple of days in the fog of my jet lag. So a useful text that I carried with me and I go back to periodically with which to look at these problems is Jawaharlal Nehru's Discovery of India, which was written when he was in jail struggling to liberate India from British rule. Nehru's vision was similar to that expressed in the text that is guiding our workshop this weekend, in that he imagined quite rightly that India was composed of, quote, widely dispersed societies, as our conference workshop blurb says, which were gradually pulled together by a variety of mechanisms, including the exchange of goods, the spread of belief systems, and political military expansion, which served as the most prominent means of trans-regional integration. Nehru's discovery of India was a discovery of a vast area of cultural diversity which had been integrated over millennia into the national space, which had been marked by British India, which formed Indian national territory. Pulling India's national history together inside an appropriate past, one that would suitably guide India's national present and future, was Nehru's life work. Nehru's India has an ancient culture, which he calls Indic, not Hindu. For it includes Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism, and its strength came from its, what he thought of and what he described as its absorptive, adaptive capacity, which enabled India to embrace Islam and Christianity as well. To his dying day, he fought Hindu nationalists who defined India as essentially Hindu, who became a major force in Indian politics 20 years after his death, and who are still working today quite hard to drive Muslims and Christians out of India's past, out of its present and also its future. Nehru and his Indian National Congress sought to integrate numerous cultural histories into India's national past, and his nationalism thus represents, I think, what we could think of as a very modern mechanism for the integration of early societies into the world in which we live. So there's the national history actually is a way of incorporating early societies, bringing them together and bringing them into the modern world. But as we know, Nehru did not get the nation he wanted. The India he discovered was split by partition in 1947. His national past became instantly archaic at that moment, and it has ironically served ever since as an implicit historical argument which actually implicitly bolsters claims by Hindu nationalists who use the term Indic to make India's present and future appear to overshadow that of Pakistan and Bangladesh. History unfolding thus changes the past, particularly as it changes the spaces that nations inhabit, their human boundaries. The partition of British India, like many other partitions of Africa, for example, or of the Ottoman Empire, produced nations which had to carve up older histories into new and typically smaller configurations that had existed in the past. In my view, one of the best things that globalization has done in the last 30 years has been to open up ideas about our past to include broader interpretive possibilities, notably in Asia, where very old histories that inform present-day national imaginations escape limitations imposed by national boundaries. Nehru knew well that his Indic civilization had been part of the vast networks of circulation since prehistoric times. Networks which had brought into India not only Sanskrit and Dravidian languages, but all the deities of the Vedic pantheon. Alexander the Great followed trade routes from Greece into India, and circulation along the Silk Road and the Indian Ocean ran through India, forming circuits of interaction that were influential in every part of South Asia. South Asia actually is very nicely, I think, you can think of it very nicely as a kind of a bridge between the Indian Ocean and the Silk Roads of Central Asia. During the first millennia of the Common Era, overlapping circuits of mobility connected Afro-Asia from one end to the other and shaped societies and territorial order in all its regions. These networks included people on the move by land and sea who focused individually and in organized groups on activities that we call religion, or that we separate with terms like religion, economic, political, and cultural activities, and technological innovation, and we think of them all separately, but all of these people were involved in all of these kinds of activities all at once. They moved in caravans, on foot, with animals, and on boats, and their mobility depended upon the work of sailors, boat builders, fisher folk, hunters, pastoral nomads, very notably pastoral nomads, and many others who lived then and remain today mostly on the margins of history. Because the literate people who composed and preserved historical documentation were elite groups living in agrarian settings of what came to be called civilization. Most of my work today and in my research generally deals with this Janet Abulagod circuit number 7 here, what you could call the Indic circuit, I suppose. But now I would like to refer to another aspect of this circuit, which is the agricultural dimension. These civilizations and the literary forms that create the historical knowledge that we have developed in and circulated among regions of increasingly dense agricultural production and dense population. This is showing the rice regions in black and the dry grain regions in the lighter colors. And we'll see that most of our activity focuses on the rice regions and nearby regions of dry cultivation, where the dense populations of Asia developed. Patterns of dense human settlement that we see in modern data, as on this map, prevailed in their basic outlines from at least the beginning of the Common Era. They derive from the steady expansion of settled farming communities who chopped down forests and worked the land to create expanding core sites of intensive agricultural production. Technologies for turning dry scrub and tropical forest into rice and wheat fields had spread widely from ancient times, but there's a definite burst in their growth and expansion that is visible in surviving texts from the first millennium of the Common Era, when the primary means for increasing human populations was not great technological innovation, but rather the expansive application of existing technologies over many, many landscapes, which were then occupied, however, landscapes that were already occupied by non-farming populations, by hunters, gatherers, nomads, and pastoralists who were variously incorporated, subordinated, displaced, and expelled from territorial domains that became dominated by farming communities whose elites lived in places that were distinguished by elements of urbanism. Stone temples and some brick structures like the stupas we'll see became lasting landmarks of the increasingly rapid and transformative agrarian expansion of the first millennium. These are the major architectural landmarks of that millennium. They appeared in the jungles and in the mountains with ever more frequency on expanding agrarian frontiers and on expanding routes and networks of circulation, which carried ever more wealth produced by labor on the land, which accumulated particularly in urban sites where forces of nature living in the world, like the elephant and the tiger, came to represent social investments of sacred power on the land. This is a carving of the elephant and a solid stone sculpture from Mahabalipuram, which is the port of Kanchipuram, which we'll see in a short while, on the coast of Tamil Nadu, very, very close to Madras, to Chennai. The social complex that that built the Indic temple emerged at the intersection of sacred and social powers, initially on agrarian landscapes in the eastern Gangetic basin, where Ayodhya, Bodh Gaya, and Benares became permanent territorial markers of divinity alive in the agrarian universe. Expansive political, economic, and ritual power moved together outward from this region, first with the Mauryan Empire in the days of Alexander, and a few centuries later with the Guptas, who built upon Mauryan imperial success and turned its sacred force away from Buddhism toward Vedic Brahmanism. As Nehru well appreciated, Buddhism, Jainism, and Vedic Brahmanism moved together and inflected one another. Based on the same cosmology and mythology, they differed primarily, socially speaking that is, in their respective spiritual commitments to the power of monastic and Brahmanical authority, respectively. Buddhism established itself along routes of Mauryan imperial expansion, notably along trade routes to the seacoast, with Emperor Ashoka's patronage, with Sanchi as its major early site, where monumental stupa architecture became a center of social activity, of teaching, of commercial investment, of social connectivity among devotees, and most notably for historians, of lasting inscriptional documentation. The stupa became a teaching place, it became a learning place, it became a public media, a medium for explaining the truth and the stories of the Buddha about the past lives of the Buddha and so on. Virtually everything we know about Indic culture in the first millennium derives from activity in and around Indic temple sites and associated institutions, notably monasteries and Brahmin settlements, all patronized by influential, resourceful people in local agrarian commercial societies, and of course also by rulers who propelled their own earthly aspirations with sacred power. Buddhist temples and their social elites and institutional order spread along routes of travel, trade, migration, and conquest, running overland and overseas, north, east, and south. Buddhism spread with the peripatetic labor of monks and with local patronage in emerging political territories, overland across Tibet to China and Japan, and overseas to Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia, and China by the sea route as well. This really quite an astounding array of Buddhist architectural sites emerged in the first millennium and were variously built upon and developed in later centuries. Most of what we know about interactions across Asia before 1400 AD derives from text produced by people traveling these routes and working in centers connected by these networks of mobility. Every one of these connected regions has its own history of long-distance connections, of regional differentiation, and of local traditions. Here I want to focus on South Asia, where some very special and distinctive developments occurred, in the first millennium, where we have to understand South Asia in this period as not being one region or one space, one unified territorial domain of culture, but rather a vast collection of small regions that were developing independently, but developing independently in local environments, but also through interconnections among networks of circulation of various sorts, where they were brought together little by little historically through the development, their mutual interaction and development into a large civilizational area that later became understood as a one single cultural area, but which certainly should not be understood that way from the beginning, and certainly not in the first millennium. In the first millennium, the Common Era, South Asia was not one region of Asia, but rather many regions, and yet its transnational integration shows definite patterns which continue to inform historical trends and dynamics to this day. This is a map that shows, this is from this short history book, and the main point of this is to show that all of these areas actually had their own dynastic histories, had their own regional histories. Every one of these areas has a very distinctive literary, cultural, political history, but they've all been lumped together and brought together inside the boundaries of modern national states. But in order to understand what was going on in the first millennium, we have to really think about them as being quite separate and developing separately. For the remainder of my presentation, I want to focus particularly on the southern peninsula and on trends that surround and define the lasting historical centrality of Indic temple complexes in that region, or in that part of South Asia. Terminology is very difficult. It's very difficult to describe areas without imagining something like a region that's a part of something else when you don't really know exactly what it's a part of, because this is a part of many different spaces at the same time. Our first stop is Kanchipuram, which is a place which opens the door to several important developments. First of all, it lay on the eastern coastal route among farm sites that connected the interior to the Indian Ocean trade centers on the coast, and this locational advantage allowed Kanchipuram to become an early urban elite complex in a region that was otherwise filled with pastoral peoples, fisher folk, and very scattered farms. Kanchipuram arose monumentally on a circuit of monastic migrations, which initially led Buddhists and Jain monks all around the south. They were really the first. The Buddhists and the Jains were really the first peripatetic religious activists in the south, who were circulating quite actively in the early centuries of the first millennium of the Common Era. They composed epic poems, which were the first epic expression of indigenous, or of the regional language of Tamil, the original literary language of this region. The Sangam poetry that had preceded this epic literature was in Tamil, but it was a Tamil that was of a much more cryptic and grammatically of a much more simplistic type. This is epic poetry, is a much more elaborate kind of poetry that's clearly inflected by the influence of Sanskrit literary forms. And what these epics really show is that there's a localization and a traveling of migratory religious lore and ideologies, and also grammatical and literary forms in the South at this time that actually was occurring more generally, but in this case we're referring to this region. Kanchipuram became an urban site for active public debate among competing religious specialists, vying for the patronage of local rulers. And in the middle of the millennium, Buddhists lost out in the competition for patronage, and Brahman Shaivites won. And from this point onward, the poetry, the Tamil poetry of the Shaivites becomes the dominant literary form in the region. And one of these poems, I guess you could say, boasts of a massacre of Buddhists that probably was a fanciful account of a kind of a mythological representation of Shiva's power on earth. Shiva really became the dominant god of this agricultural and political frontier in the south. And I have to say that now that I've begun to work more in the northeastern parts of South Asia, in Bengal and nearby areas, I've discovered that Shiva was actually the dominant god in many of these frontier environments for the whole first millennium. And this Shaivite power was wielded by Brahmins and by aspiring royal Pallava patrons in the area that is near, in Kanchipuram and Mahabalipuram near Madras, what is now Chennai in northern Tamil Nadu. The cults of the two great, this is trying to show, I don't know whether you can quite see it, but this is trying to show that that this was an area where Kanchipuram is there near Madras in the north. It's spelled Kanjipuram there. That's the old British way of spelling it. And the idea here is that these were areas where irrigated rice agriculture was developing quite notably. So the Pallavas were in Kanchipuram, and the Cholas emerged in Tanjore, which is the next big in the delta here. And this little place in the south, Tirunelveli, is actually where I did my research, but similarly a place of growing irrigated rice agriculture. The cults of the two great Puranic gods, Shiva and Vishnu, then became imperial forces for trans-regional integration up and down the eastern coast of the peninsula. We can follow their progress through the ever-expanding corpus of Tamil devotional poetry, but more materially through the inscriptions that are carved in the walls of temples and preserved in copper plates recording transactions in and around the temple complex. Shaiva and Vaishnava poetic devotees virtually buried earlier genres of Tamil literature, Tamil poetry, which had minimal Brahmin input and very little Sanskrit influence and no connection with the Indic temples, whatever. The Sangam poetry basically disappeared until it was rediscovered in the later part of the 19th century in oral traditions and manuscripts that had been preserved, it seems, primarily by Jains, who survived outside the dominance of Brahmanical Hinduism, which arose under the Pallavas and expanded throughout the Tamil country under later dynasties. Trans-regional integration in the peninsula progressed with the multiplication of temple sites and of Brahmin communities patronized by local rulers and by landed elites who composed inscriptions recording transactions through which they devised more powerful systems of control over land and labor in territories that they called mandalams. The mandalam was a cosmic domain of royal influence, which is focused centrally on particular major temples. As scholars have shown since the 1970s, it is both plausible to call these expanding polities imperial, but also quite inaccurate to think of them as resulting from the imposition of imperial state power on local communities. It is more accurate to imagine that the mandalam, the temple-centered mandalam, and the nadus and the mahanadus of which they were composed, emerged and in the inscriptional record, as we can see them emerging in the inscriptional record as imperial, what I would call imperial societies. In other words, they were built really from below by local communities interacting with emerging dominant military groups. And they emerged in the relationship between non-Brahmin landowners and Brahmins, and they were enriched by merchants working commercial networks running across agrarian tracts, connecting mountain forests and lowland farms with the sea trades. They were supported by warrior alliances that were emerging from local agrarian castes, and it also including, more and more including, as you can see in the inscriptions, an increasing number of warrior pastoralists and hunters who were then being integrated into the local society. The temple, the Indic temple, was a human technology invented and propagated in the first millennium, which produced a massive transformation of social life by integrating regions across vast distances and differentiating populations and localities according to imperial ideologies of rank. The gods became ranked, with Buddha and Puranic deities on top, and all their locally embedded cosmic relatives, consorts, partners, and competitors and victims ranked below, representing the incorporation of religious ideas and spiritual persona from countless local societies into regional imperial formations. One of the most beautiful articulations of this cultural ranking is the language of the inscriptions themselves, which were composed in grantha script forms that actually were capable of representing various languages at the same time. And at the top of the inscriptions, in the evocative part of the inscription, it would always be written in Sanskrit. And then underneath, in what I call the business part of the inscription, where the donations and the gifts are being recorded, these would then be in Tamil, in the local languages. They were meant to be understood and read by local people. And in the tribal areas, where I'm now doing more work in northeastern India, we find, and I was just reading the other day, that there actually are representations of languages in these inscriptions that people have no other record of at all. They seem to have been tribal languages that were oral at the time, and so that the readers of these inscriptions would be able to speak to these tribal people, even though the languages of the tribal people themselves were not represented in literature independently outside the inscription. So these inscriptions are clearly intended to speak to a variety of audiences in a language of ranking and in the ranking of languages. In the hands of Brahmin Sanskrit scholars, philosophers, and priests, the Puranic gods became terrestrial rulers of dharma, varna, and jati, that is, of the social architecture of caste society, which became the social substance of trans-regional integration among agrarian societies. This is a map that shows Brahmadeyas in the Tirunelveli, mostly along the river valley of the Tamraparni, as you can see. Brahmin settlements called Brahmadeyas were created by local and royal grants of land and labor to Brahmin families, who became the focal point of agrarian civility. An urbane class of savants and experts in all fields of knowledge. These Brahmins knew the Vedas, they were authors, they were priests, they were doctors, they were protectors of social norms and justice, they were engineers, they were agricultural scientists. They did all sorts of spreading of all sorts of different kinds of knowledge that was required for the advancement of agriculture and for the development of these agrarian societies. Brahmadeyas multiplied alongside temples and irrigation dams and paddy fields, as social ranks and roles defined in relation to Brahmins became the glue of social order, from the lowest ranks of the slave and the bonded laborers in the fields to the highest ranks of imperial authority. As the millennium progressed, imperial domains got larger and larger, and real state systems emerged, the largest being that of the Cholas. The Brahmadeya environments, therefore, became more and more elaborately subject to inscriptional records, which record more and more institutional complexity. More officers of the state, state-appointed, emperor-appointed officers overseeing temple activities, protectors of temples who are various ranks of local and regional warriors, and so on. So you can see an increasing elaboration of the state apparatus inside the inscriptions through the various operations and the donative transactions that are part of the sustenance of the Brahmadeyas. The Brahmadeyas were in a sense the social environment surrounding the part of the temple complex where the temple complex was related to the everyday activity of the society. As the millennium progressed, imperial domains got larger and larger and more elaborate, and the largest one on the Tamil coast was that of the Cholas, based in the Tanjore Delta. And like all their competitors and contemporaries in other regions of India, Cholas expanded by conquest and overlordship of lesser rajas rather than by accumulating more territory to administer. Their fame and glory spread as inscriptions recorded their supremacy over local subordinates in wider and wider territories. But for them, as for all their contemporary regimes, imperial expansion merely increased the ranks the ritualized ranks in their imperial relations to lesser authorities, rather than an administrative apparatus of any major sort. And in these domains, local people did not have to just bow down. They could bow down to one or two competing rajas at the same time. And superiors and inferiors could interact without necessarily local people or inferior people giving up their local power. So it was a kind of a nested system of ranks and of territorial authority. Cholas also sent merchants, warriors, and Brahmins to spread their fame and glory overseas, spreading the inscriptional evidence of Chola cosmic authority all the way to the South China coast, and propagating Brahmanical ritual forms among aspiring rulers in Champa, Bali, and Java. The greatest Chola ruler, Raja Chola, who is represented here in this gold image, styled himself the Mahadiraja, the #1 greatest Raja of all Rajas in the world. And he built a cult around himself in Tanjore. In the late part of the first millennium, an increasing number of major rulers in different imperial domains in India started building royal cults around themselves. And he spread his largesse according to the pattern depicted in this transactional map, which is actually an effort to map all the transactions of his central temple. And as you can see, the transactions concentrate in one particular area, but then expand little by little over time. So the Chola Empire, although it was very vast in terms of its reputation and its spread of its fame, in terms of its actual donative transactional activity, it was actually very, very compact. Most of the gifts and the transactions of the Raja and of the Chola dynasty were actually in the Tanjore Delta and nearby areas, although they expanded slowly over time. At the same time, inscriptions were broadcast over a very large territory, praising the greatness of the ruler, and being composed by warriors who were marching all over the place, conquering local chiefs. There we are. In Indic temple regions, including those of Southeast Asia like Angkor Wat and Bali, imperial society emerged within ritual social relations among major powers in highly stratified communities where social identity and social mobility appear they appear in the records and in literary evidence that spread around what Sheldon Pollock has called the Sanskrit cosmopolis, a vast trans-regional space where Sanskrit authors produce texts describing cosmic order in the world of humans. The vast bulk of evidence carved into copper and stone inscriptions concern ritual gifts recorded in public spaces by people of superior rank to express and convey their social power, and also reciprocal offerings by people in lower ranks to pay their homage and their loyalty to superiors. All these transactions are modeled on service and offerings to the god, and on sanctified gifts from the god, prasad, to the devotees. The ritual discourse of giving and of receiving and of protecting, enforcing, and enriching these transactions among the ranks of imperial society produced a cultural lexicon to inform emerging systems of patriarchy, labor bondage, land ownership, taxation, and commercial regulation. The language of the temple, in other words, was spread throughout. The discourse and the grammar of temple social relations inside the temple and the relations between people and gods became the generalized discourse of relations among people of higher and lower rank throughout the society. Donations to the god in the temple, and to the king and his court became public rituals of rank, conferring honor and power on donors and on recipients alike. These relations of gifting and of receiving gifts, of giving and receiving, provided entry points. These ritual moments of giving and receiving provided entry points into local societies for visitors and investors, for anyone seeking a place in local environments, in local temple environments. People could come, they could give gifts to the temple, they could give gifts to the Brahmins, they could receive benefits from the Brahmins, they could get blessings from the Brahmins, and thus they could enter the local ranks, the local landscape of social relations and enter into the ranking system. So that actually, even though we inherit a long tradition of ideas about the rigidity of the caste system and the stifling character of the hierarchy of caste, in reality, the temple complex provided a vast set of opportunities for social mobility through the engagement in transactions with people of higher and lower rank inside the temple, inside the ambit of temple social relations. Temples also became, of course, the major landmarks in agrarian landscapes. Even to this day, when you go around South India, and actually a lot of India, if you ask for directions, the first thing that people will tell you is they'll give you directions in relation to a local temple or a local shrine or something like that. So it became, of course, the landscape in many cases is extremely flat, so that the temple is basically all you can see. And these things were built up at a very, very large scale in very early times in the 5th, 6th, 7th, but particularly in the 9th and 10th and 11th and 12th and 13th century. So the temples got bigger, the complexes got bigger and huger as time went by. And this expansion of the size of the temple represents an expansion or an increase in the total wealth that was invested in the temple complexes. Temples and Brahmadeyas, but particularly temples, ended up owning huge amounts of land. They were donated by rulers and by local landowners, and that were protected and brought within the framework of transactions that centered on the sanctity of the god. The growing of the temple spread the fame of localities, and localities therefore became richer and more attractive to merchants and craftspeople, to productive people of all sorts. Inscriptions make it very clear that temple donations were understood as investments in the sacred power of place, as well as that of people engaged in the donative activity. In other words, these aren't just individuals seeking self-gratification. These are actually collections of investments in localities within which many people were invested. Temples became the central places for dance, for drama, for song, for arts, literature, for craft work, for handicraft, industrial production. Kanchipuram became a very important site for cloth production. Kanchipuram silk is still one of the most famous varieties of silk work in South Asia. Temples became the center of commercial life and of all the elements, the accumulation of all the elements that comprise urbanism in South India. At the center of the ideology and social life that evolved around the temple lay the cultural equation of cosmic and earthly power. The dancing Shiva is, in my mind, its perfect expression. Bursting from the entry gate to the great Chola temple, Shiva literally explodes from the hidden inner sanctum where only the Brahmin priest can tread into the everyday world of social life. He's dancing a cosmic dance, holding the world order in place with his charisma, dancing on a demon who represents all of his lowly enemies, and most materially, who clearly represents forest dwellers and tribal people whom Shiva's devotees were busily conquering to expand their own agricultural settlements. Then, of course, he becomes the embodiment of high art, a portable icon of the most advanced forms of metal sculpture developed in the first millennium. Then his movements become dance, the dance of dancing girls in the temple, and the high art forms of cultural production that would become Bharatanatyam. Local gods who had been scattered across the tribal landscape became Shiva's relatives as local communities developed devotional practices by which to incorporate their folk deities into Shiva's cosmic empire. Murugan is one such deity who had been worshipped in Sangam times, earlier centuries, by animist tribal peoples, and who were being conquered and then incorporated into Shaivite societies, made their god part of Shiva's family. And so this then became the map of the Murugan temples, therefore became part of the map of the geography of the Chola Tanjore Delta. This is the delta right there, as you can see. As the imperial Chola technologies of power moved upstream, uphill into the center of the peninsula, in the Kaveri River basin, they spawned competitors who were based in the highlands. This is an example of something we've heard about during our workshop, of actually new productive, new challenging powers emerging on the peripheries of existing power. This is exactly what happened in the late first millennium in South India. New challengers to the Cholas emerged from warrior peoples who lived in the highlands in the interior of the peninsula, who expanded agriculture down the Kaveri Basin, but also benefited from, more than the Cholas, from their connections with the trade of the Arabian Sea, and also from overland routes of trade leading into North India, Rajasthan, Gujarat, and even to Afghanistan. Moving down from the uplands, a new set of agrarian military alliances expanded their power by the recruitment of upland pastoralists, hunters, horse-mounted fighters, and bowmen. This dynasty was called that of the Hoysalas, whose new imperial territory pushed the Cholas back to the coast and opened up a new era of technological change and imperial militarism, which was duly recorded in their temple sculptures, which now focus quite notably, innovatively, a very different new kind of genre of artistic sculpture emerges that emphasizes the role of mundane human power particularly of the Hoysala warriors and soldiers. This that is to say, as distinct from the power of Shiva. This is the trend of the second millennium. This is the trend of the next stage of the incorporation of regions into South India and even more India more generally, with the rise of the warriors in imperial systems whose rapid expansion overlapped zones of military competition running from the far south all across India into Afghanistan and Central Asia. This was the time when Turks began moving south into the peninsula as Mongols moved west in the beginning of the second millennium. This trend of large-scale and more specialized military imperial expansion began with the late Cholas. The early Chola armies were actually composed really of peasants who were fighting in the off-season. There would be the monsoon season, they would be farming, and then in the off-season they would go off and form armies and fight battles. They were, shall we say, part-time soldiers at best. Under the Hoysalas and later dynasties, the soldiers became more and more specialized, more and more year-round, more and more employed on the basis of revenue, taxation extracted from landowners, and the imperial elites became more and more separate from the agrarian elites throughout large parts of India. The major group that really became the sort of the epitome of this, of course, became the Rajputs later on, but the Hoysalas were actually moving very clearly in this direction by the first part of the second millennium, and this trend toward the creation of large-scale military empires culminated among the Mughals in the 16th century. Hoysala temple art is one of the most amazing records of social and economic evolution or change that you could ever imagine. It goes from the Chola pattern of being a representation purely of mythological stories and tales of Shiva and the gods, with a few references, sculptural references to the Chola families and the various elites of the Cholas, to being a full-scale representation of the military, of the actual military power of the Hoysala regime itself. here we have a real, I guess you could call it, I don't know whether you want to call it a secularization, but certainly it's a humanization of divine power of a major sort, in which we find descriptions, sculptural descriptions of warfare, of technologies, of the animals and the horses. Even on some of the sculptures, you can even see the military configurations that the soldiers would go in when they were fighting. You see the armored elephants and the armored horses and all the apparatus of war. But the most important thing from my point of view that I want to emphasize here is that these are clearly representations of a new technology of warfare that's being introduced into South India, which is the Arabian horse. These horses indicate another feature of the great transition between the first and the second millennium. That is the increasing salience of overseas and overland trade in Arabian horses imported into South India. Such animals do not breed well in the peninsula. In fact, they don't breed well anywhere in India. They degenerate very quickly in 1 or 2 generations, and thus the continued utilization of these kinds of large, powerful horses requires constant new imports all the time. Expansive Arab trade networks by sea and Turk horse imports over land provided a technological basis for the next age of large-scale warfare, marked in the early second millennium by massive fort building, increasing land revenue extraction, and the elevation of military men to positions of imperial superiority over all their subordinates and all their inferiors of a level of scale that would far outshine anything that the Chola emperors could even ever have imagined. But even so, as the elaboration of imperial ranks to higher and higher levels produced trans-regional integration at an ever-expanding scale, and more ranks appeared below in the lower levels of imperial order, the Indic temple complex and the imperial society it sustained remained the foundation of the political economy. The reason why I call this the imperial society is because this is a society that was quite able to adapt to the emergence of higher levels of imperial authority. Jawaharlal Nehru liked to think of this as being the absorption of different kinds of cultural traits when the Mughals would come or the British would come and so on. But the way I'm thinking of it now is that instead of it being an absorption, what it is it's an ability of this imperial society of imperial ranks to adjust to the emergence of higher levels of authority, and for the people who are in these ranks of the imperial society to move up the ranks of the increasingly elaborate imperial hierarchy. And this is exactly what happened in the later centuries. And this is actually where I'll end with 2 of my favorite illustrations. One is an 18th century painting, actually, of a 17th century Mughal chronicle. And it shows the Mughal emperor receiving the homage of his nobles. All of these nobles are named. They could be easily identified on the basis of the pictures. And they represent all the different ethnic groups and the cultural groups who were subordinate to the Mughals. This is something that would be very easy for someone who was coming out of the tradition of the Chola imperial society to read and to understand. It's a kind of a homage, a paying of obeisance and of loyalty to a ruler who occupies higher ranks in the same kind of cultural idiom that would have been the case for the Cholas and the Hoysalas. And this is exactly what happened. The Mughal Empire was built upon an existing imperial society that was run around temples and run by Brahmins, and the Mughals employed the Brahmins and they married into the families of the Rajputs, and everybody understood where the ranks of the society were. They were getting more elaborate, they were having more cultural complexity at the top, but at the bottom there was this continuous expansion and elaboration and enrichment of the temple complex and the imperial society that surrounded it. More and more temples were built as the second millennium went on, and in fact more temples were built under the Mughals than had been ever built before. And then in the 18th century, the British come and they, again, establish themselves at the top of this imperial hierarchy. And in the 18th and 19th century and in the 20th century, more and more temples are built, and this imperial society running around the temple expanded more and more under the auspices of British India. This lithograph on the right is a lithograph that adorns the bottom of a huge map that was produced by James Rennell at the end of the 18th century. And it shows, it's this incredible thing, you know. You've got, in the background, you've got the ship, the East India Company ships. Underneath the arm of this one bowing Brahmin here, you can see a farmer in the background plowing the fields. Then you've got the top clearly the top of a South Indian gopuram of a major temple in the background. And then you have these Brahmins who are giving to Britannia the something. And nobody knows. We're always fighting. We're having endless arguments about actual gift is here. But the thing is that whether you think of it, as some of my colleagues do, as a kind of a forced, coercive moment where these people are bowing down out of a sense of suppression and or whether you think of them as being, shall we say, obsequious givers of the keys of the kingdom to Britannia. In any case, they're Brahmins interacting with the great Kshatriya, the great ruling power, who is, of course, a Roman sort of image-built kind of imperial British queen figure that you all know more about than I do. And on her right here, we have some merchants who are sitting there going, "Oh boy, this is great! I can't wait to get my hands on this place." And then on the ground, we have the most wonderful thing, which is Rennell, of course. He was a what happened? He was a surveyor, and he was making the map for the East India Company, and the map on which this this lithograph is the first really huge big map of India for the British, and these are surveying tools on the ground. Again, at the service, we might say, of Britannia. And then the lion and the globe and the whole thing is there. So you've got this whole imagery of the Brahmins, shall we say, showing up one way or the other, whether you think of it as a coercion or you think of it as a gift. I'm tending to try to create the picture that this is actually the Brahmins kind of signing up for another round of imperial incorporation and saying, well, okay, we can deal with this, and we'll just carry on. And I think this is pretty much what happened in British India, and certainly in large parts of British India. Something very much like this represents the adaptation of an old and adaptive imperial society to another round of imperial incorporation. The ritualized discourse and social relations of Brahmanical caste-based imperial society that became the foundation for trans-regional integration in the first millennium continued its development and elaboration in modern times. And I think you could say that, in fact, even today, it continues to dominate the dynamics of economic and political and social inequity inside contemporary globalization in India. Thank you very much. That's the end, and thank you for listening.
You hinted at the beginning of your talk and then at the end about the relationship to current globalization, and I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about how this your talk might be relevant towards what's going on in the world today, and maybe specifically in this region.
Okay. The reason why I was so enthusiastic about doing this paper is that I'm now reconsidering the question of inequality in South Asia, and in India in particular. As you all may know, the expansion of the free market economy and liberalization and so on in India in the last 20 years has accompanied a fairly rapid increase in economic inequality. Now that increase is not new. It was already happening, and it has certain patterns that are worth considering. And socially speaking, some of those patterns include the increasing decline in the living standard of Muslims in India, which has been recently documented in a very major way by the Session Commission report. A major increase in the economic and social mobility of higher caste people in the world of globalization more generally. And a continuation of what Atul Kohli and other people who really study this very intensely call an intensification of want and deprivation in the midst of this great boom of wealth in India. That increase of want and deprivation is not occurring randomly in the population. It's occurring in a fairly reasonable, understandable pattern, which corresponds quite nicely, not perfectly, but rather nicely to some of the patterns of this imperial society that I'm talking about. Other things that are important to me, anyway, that are, I think, important if you look more closely, is that there are areas in India that are still actually frontiers of economic expansion. The tribal populations of the hills that are really the last bastion of the last frontier of economic and political expansion in India have been frontiers for a long time, which is what I've been trying to indicate here, and I could have done that story too. But today, one of the main sources of concern in India is the outburst of Maoist violence in the eastern mountains of central India. And this is occurring precisely in regions where the economic expansion under globalization is pushing into the hills and destroying the hills for the exploitation of natural resources and displacing tribal people and so on. Now, a lot of people are really think of this as a horrible invention of globalization, that these capitalists under the support of the state would be out there trying to destroy the living environments of the tribal population. But what I want to try to suggest is that there's a lot of this kind of frontier expansion that's been part of the Indian political economy for a long time. And it's actually very much a part of the normal progress of the civilization if we start thinking of it in terms of these social power relations that I'm trying to describe. I could go on, but I think maybe we should. But does that get to the point? Well, there is one last thing which occurred to us only last week. We had a conference actually at NYU with a wonderful political scientist from India, Zoya Hassan, who came, and we had a seminar where Zoya was talking about this problem of the really continuing decline of the living standards of Muslims in India, which is really quite noticeable. Not only are they the victims of violence, of Hindu chauvinists and so on and so forth, but just economically the decline is quite serious. And so one of the things that came up as we started talking about why is it that Muslims don't have political representation with respect to the improvement of their living conditions in India. Dalits have it. Lower caste people have it. There's constant mobilization around the improvement of conditions of lower caste people, even though it doesn't necessarily work. And one of the answers to the problem of the Muslims in India is that the discourse of social justice in India is really dominated, or really you could even say controlled, by the language of caste. So that the language of caste actually is the Indian language for talking about social inequality. And it's very difficult to incorporate Muslims into a discourse that's based upon the language of caste. When Dalits leave Hinduism and go to another religion, like to Christianity or to Islam, they are no longer entitled under the Indian law to the benefits of these affirmative action programs. And the argument is they've left the society, they've left the ritual situation in which their degradation has been established, so therefore they're no longer subject to that degradation anymore. The whole legal system actually assumes that the caste framework of the hierarchy and the ranking of a caste actually is the language of social inequity in India. What I'm referring to here is, yes, that's true, but there's also this outside. It's the tribal populations, it's the Muslim populations that are also part of the long-term history within which this imperial inequality has been, expanding and living, we might say, under different types of regimes.
Yeah, you very nicely brought out the structure of India where Brahmins could survive over 2 centuries, 2,000 years. Brahmins, the Buddhist religion could not survive in India because Brahmins were able to let it go out. It did not let it survive. And so did many other religions which were born in India but could not survive there and had to be almost exported. And same thing like, you very nicely brought out the Hindu structured society, like caste system, which is, the society is plagued by it. Now, the Brahmins take advantage of this system and then they are able to survive 2,000 years. In the present context, when we got independence, we made secular, constitution allowed secularism to spread. But even then, we were not able to take this part of the problem out of the country. Now, having studied so much in your studies of this last 2,000 years, do you think this caste system will stay or will it go away?
Let me just say that I began my work in South India, so I started work in an environment where the non-Brahmin movement was and remains very strong. And the idea there was, and when I was coming up in school, that the Brahmins had invaded South India and taken over the place, and the non-Brahmins had been subjected to their domination of North Indians. Okay, basically North Indian Sanskrit-speaking Brahmins and so on. But as I started studying, especially when you study the inscriptional literature and you try to explain, where did these Brahmadeyas come from? Who's giving all this stuff to the Brahmins? Okay, what you realize, what it can be very plausibly argued, and I think is pretty well established at this point because the argument really began in the 70s, and I think it was pretty well settled by the middle 80s, is that it's non-Brahmins who create the Brahmins. The Brahmins didn't take over the South. It's basically the landowners, the Rajas. These were not Brahmins. They were, shall we say, aligning themselves with the Brahmins. They were creating support for a system of ranking and of hierarchy that allowed them to have more power in their society also. And in this case, I think what I've tried to say here, but I've maybe said it too quickly, is that the key things over which they wanted to have power was land. They wanted to have indisputable property ownership over land. And they wanted to have indisputable power and control over labor. Okay? And that these two things enabled non-Brahmin groups, and this is true everywhere in India, to maintain control of local economies, which, to be honest with you, has been extremely solid for a very long time. So you could even say that if you wanted to, that the rise of non-Brahmin groups in India in the last 50 or even 100 years has been very profound. They've become more and more powerful. Now they politically are in control of most of the political parties. So what's happened to the Brahmins? The Brahmins aren't necessarily the most powerful politically, but if you look at the levels of education, if you look at social mobility based upon technical education and so on, or you look at the scholars, you look at the whole world of academic life, you find it's just filled with Brahmins. So you find actually that there's been all sorts of adaptations of this social world of ranking to changing political economy and changing economic conditions. So I don't think it's just the case. It wouldn't be fair to say that the Brahmins have done this, all this, by themselves. They're part of a much larger arrangement. I don't know what that is. I have to just kill that. Sorry. It's probably taxi somewhere. So I'm trying to describe something that's much more adaptive and much more flexible and much more evolving than the simple maintenance of the power of the Brahmins. That's my sort of approach.
With your lecture, I'm very much impressed. The most important thing I want to ask that when most of the areas got independence, whether it was Bangladesh, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Sri Lanka, what is the element which makes the democratic principles survive in India compared to the other neighboring countries?
My goodness. Not exactly in the scope of what I'm talking about, but fortunately, because of my, just general life environment, it's something that I'm confronted with fairly regularly. And I think it's a good question. In fact, truth of the matter is that there is democracy in Bangladesh. There is democracy in Sri Lanka. Some people would argue that there's democracy trying in Pakistan. And certainly there's democracy trying in Nepal, which always usually gets left out. So one could argue, certainly, that democracy is a kind of a goal, right? It's a shared goal of the political regimes, of all the political regimes in South Asia. Now that goal, then you ask the question, what allows one environment to propagate or to achieve success in the quicker or more fulsomely than another in the pursuit of that goal? And I think that in the case of South Asia, there's a tendency, and with all due respect, there's a tendency to think of India as being a model, to think of India as being the success, and that the other places are just really not, successes. So it's a kind of as though you could compare India to Bangladesh or Pakistan, in a one-to-one kind of way, as though they were just sort of even and they started on an even playing field and so on and so forth. Well, the truth of the matter is, as you could well appreciate, India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan did not start on an even playing field. In 1947, India retained everything of value, really, that was left in British India. And Pakistan and Bangladesh were provincial territories that had very little in the way of infrastructure or most of the apparatus that could inform a political development of democracy, which India had. Okay, so that you could say that actually Pakistan and Bangladesh, not to mention Nepal, are actually doing pretty well if you think of the fact that they started from nothing in 1947, and that India has expanded its democratic apparatus, to be sure. But if you look at human development indicators, you'll find that in many respects Bangladesh has done pretty well compared to India, and certainly compared to the parts of India that have the same kind of per capita income that they have in Bangladesh. So Bangladesh is a poor country that's done relatively well compared to India, and India looks even worse if you compare it with respect to human development indicators compared to China, where no democracy ever, but almost 100% literacy, very high literacy, huge, big benefits in health, basic health compared to India. And right from the beginning, I mean, literally, they emerged in 1949 under extremely difficult conditions, 25, 30 years of warfare, of, all sorts of disruptions and conquest and so on. And within 15 years, China was in a place where India just isn't still in that place. So democracy and inequity go together in India. And this is, of course, an important thing to keep in mind. And this is true especially for anyone who is aware of the situation in the United States, where democracy and inequity go together all the time. And it's almost like a permanent bond between the two. Inequity is constantly being reproduced inside environments of democracy. And in America, where democracy is alive and well, and voting and even the participation rates, voter turnout rates are actually improving, real wages for the poor, real wages in the country have been going down for the last 30 years, and the wages and the benefits of investors is going up and up relative to the real wages. So you've got a situation where inequality is increasing and democracy is flourishing, and there we are. one of the questions then becomes is, to what extent is it possible to use democracy as a way of getting, for the poor people to get leverage on the improvement of their material conditions? In the United States, it doesn't seem like there's really any great promise of doing that, and so far in India, it's been elusive as well.
To what do you attribute the continuing importance of the role of Indic temples during the Muslim Mughal period?
Right. Okay. Now this is I'm very glad you asked that question. In what you might call, let's find out the right word here. In what you might call popular or conventional representations of South Asian history, right? There's a period of Muslim rule that appears, right? It starts in the 14th century or thereabouts in the north, and then the Muslim rule under the Mughals really covers the subcontinent more or less, okay? The question is, what does Muslim rule mean? Okay, what does it mean? Well, in some versions of South Asian history, what it means is that Islam and Muslim populations actually controlled the country or controlled the regime, okay? In actual reality, this is not what happened. In actual reality, what happened is that there were rulers who were Muslims and who maintained a strata of Muslim elites, for sure, and who actually were continuously, those elites were continuously enriched by migrations from Persia, for example, most notably. Well, first the Turks and then Persians and so on. And they were strengthened by military means and by economic power and building and so on and so forth. So that they made a very large space for themselves in terms of creating an imperial stratum of a very high stature and a very beautiful art and, wonderful cultural forms and so on. But in the everyday running of these so-called Muslim imperial domains, it was all, underneath that top layer, it was all run by non-Muslims, basically. You could call them Hindus. I always back off from that because the word Hindu is actually used as a gloss for a whole range of different belief systems that are out there and ritual systems that are out there. But one thing that did hold all of these different groups together was a participation in the kind of imperial society surrounding the temple complex that I'm describing here. And this is true wherever you go in Mughal India, literally wherever you go. Whether it's with the Jamidars or whether it's with the Rajas who were under the Mughals, or even the Rajputs, who were the major beneficiary, the biggest beneficiaries of the Mughal regime were the Rajputs. They married into the Mughal house, into the royal house. They became the Rajputs, the grand Rajputs, under the Mughals. That's when they became so grand. The great merchant communities emerged under the Mughals, et cetera, et cetera. And temple patronage actually increased. So building of new temples. The 1961, I forgot to mention this because it's a little bit too boring to actually bring to a talk, but a lot of this research on temples that became such a big part of historical thinking in the 70s and 80s emerged because of the 1961 census, which actually created a survey of all the temples of India. And all of a sudden people realized how many temples there were, what their dates were, what the different deities were, and so on and so forth, so that you could do this research based upon government census data. And if you look at the 61 census, you'll see, now it only counted used temples. I mean, temples that were still in use, okay? So all the old broken down things weren't in there. And a lot of old broken down temples that people aren't using where there's no deity and stuff. And they're just sort of sitting there and people are taking stones out and using it for making bunds on the irrigation works and so on. So those are out there and those are old. But in terms of the actually used temples, there are more and more and more of them in later centuries. Now this is of course partly because the newer ones will survive more easily. But it's also because more and more of them are being built. And there's lots of other evidence to show this also. That under these Muslim regimes, Brahmins and temples and even temple grants, Muslim rulers were giving lots of temple grants. The Nawab of Bengal in the 18th century was giving lots of temple grants and hiring Brahmins and kayasths by the truckload to man the expansive administration. The last but not least technical detail that's very important here is that the most important thing that happened under the Mughals and the British that really affected the sort of the structure of this higher caste elite was the expansion of the revenue apparatus of the state. So that the more and more the revenue apparatus of the state expanded, the more and more you needed accounting, you needed bankers, you needed all the technical people who could deal with the collecting and the record keeping and all this kind of stuff. And all of the people who did that were among the high caste literary groups. There were very few members of the elite Muslim strata who did that kind of work anywhere in India. So as a result of that, and also the merchant classes, of course, did quite well in Mughal India, and they continued to donate to temples in the same way they had done before. I'm sure everyone, well, maybe not everyone is aware, but one of the most fabulous gaudy temples in India, of course, is the Birla Temple in Kolkata, which is a perfect example of the way in which the aspiring, upwardly mobile nouveau riche really love to build temples. I mean, building temples is a wonderful, wonderful thing. And they're major markers of social arrival and of social stature and of patronage. The ability to build a temple and to donate to a temple allows you to provide patronage for many people to come and to enjoy, and et cetera, et cetera. So, plus your name is read. You know, like with the way the Sultan's name would be cited on the Friday prayers, in the temple, the donors' names are being read out during the rituals of the temple, and that's the inscriptions are, announcing the grandeur of the donors at all points, and so on. So it's the emergence of a middle class, even nouveau riche populations is articulated through temples, and it's true in the United States actually now also, and in the world of the diaspora, when a community starts having its own, major economic figures, one of the first things that they want to do is they want to get together and gather money from the local community to build a temple. So it's an ongoing social technology of great versatility and fun, actually, a lot of fun.
Thank you, David. It's been great listening to you.
All right, thank you very much.